So it's very
Yeah.
happy childhood. Zero interest in debate. Like debate was not something on my radar at all. The thing I
Ooh.
was really obsessed with was probably two things actually. One was basketball. Basketball was by far and away the biggest like motivating factor for me getting up in the
Yeah.
morning. Like, I would skip lessons in school to play basketball. I got kicked out of the robotics club because I skipped all of their sessions to go and play basketball. Mm.
You sometimes just wake up and you find your response to certain things which are happening within your life and within society a bit different, and you can find it quite surprising that, oh, I don't think I was always this way.
On the other hand, are debaters mendacious, distortionary, cherry picking morons a lot of the time? Oh, absolutely, because the format of the game demands that, right? And
Yeah.
also, debaters are very good at justifying backward.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Shaft podcast. My name is Andrews, co hosting this episode with Erasmus, and today we'll be having a conversation with a very interesting individual um, within the debate world, and also just before hopping on, literally roasting debaters for not being outdoor enough. So we'll try and explore his out of the debate world experiences at work, which I'm sure would be much more interesting. But just 2 points of introduction. I think, first of all, he is the most recent debating champion in the world in terms of winning the HWS round robin in April. Uh, this month, actually, earlier this month, a few weeks back. But also, he's famously known, specifically within the African circles, probably as the father of principles because of his lecture on shiny principles. I personally, for instance, made notes from those two videos that it guided my ability to argue principles for a very, very long time. In fact, I went back to look at those notes just before this episode started, and they are really, really interesting stuff there. But yes, today we are here on with Ashish Kumar. So Ashish, welcome to this episode.
Hi, great, yeah, great to be on.
Yeah. What did Erasmus tell you to convince you to come? Because he
Oh,
sometimes his methods are not ethical, so
yeah.
we just want to be sure.
Well, he was very pleasant about it. I think we were at HWS. In fact, I think
Yeah.
Erasmus and I bumped to each other in like round one.
Okay.
And I think at some point we
Yeah,
had a
yeah,
conversation,
yeah, yeah.
right? I think in the big hall where everyone was gathered, he was like, "Oh, we have a podcast. You should jump on at some point." I was like, "Yeah, sure. Send the link over." And it
Yeah.
turns out I had a totally free day today, so I said,
Oh.
"Why don't we just do it today?" So it was. I can assure you, Andrews, it was terribly ethical.
I must say, my coach always tells me that when you take a fourth in a round, make sure you, or when you enter a round, make sure you take something from it. So after taking a fourth, I think the next best thing was getting Ashish on the podcast. So I'm not going to finish the round.
It was a pretty strong room for a HWS, I must say. That was
Yeah,
a pretty good room.
to be honest,
Yeah.
yes. And to have that room in round one, to presume that that room was randomly put up, sometimes I don't believe it. I'm like, who, which random elements come together to put together one of the strongest rooms you could possibly stumble into the tournament right from round one? But
Can I be honest though? I didn't
yeah,
realize it was a strong room because I just don't recognize people anymore. Like
yeah,
literally the only person in the debate I recognized apart from Tejas was Erasmus, right? Because we had met
ah,
each other in Madrid and we had a pretty nice
yeah,
conversation.
yeah.
But
So
only it
strongest
was
from a
just yeah, it was in the middle of the debate that Tejas leaned over and was like, "Oh yeah, that guy's world champion. The other guy speaker Australs." I'm like, "Oh, cool.
yeah,
I guess that happened. You know."
yeah. Yeah, it is, which is something we'll talk about coming back into HWS. It's quite
Mm.
interesting for me to know from your perspective how these things felt after probably a long break from speaking as well. Um, but first, we just want to get a sense of your childhood. What was childhood like for you, and what did you enjoy the most about it? Because a lot of us reminisce over childhood memories, and I think these days we look back on it and even wish we were children again because of some of the fun moments that
Mhm.
we experienced. So, what do you think you would describe your childhood to be, and what were the most exciting moments in there for you?
Yeah, so I would describe my childhood as like a fairly typical Singaporean childhood. Like, if you're not especially well-to-do in terms of money,
Yeah.
um, I think I would have a pretty normal childhood by those standards. I was
Okay.
pretty happy. The only one really stressful thing in it was like examinations because Singapore is like really big on examinations, or at least it was insanely big on examinations.
Yeah.
At the time at which I was still in my, doing primary school, secondary school. So it's very
Yeah.
happy childhood. Zero interest in debate. Like debate was not something on my radar at all. The thing I
Oh.
was really obsessed with was probably two things actually. One was basketball. Basketball was by far and away the biggest like motivating factor for me getting up in the
Yeah.
morning. I would skip lessons in school to play basketball. I got kicked out of the robotics club because I skipped all of their sessions to go and play basketball. My parents had to forcibly remove me from basketball as a
Wow.
curricular activity in my last year in primary school, so I didn't flunk my national examinations. So that was the main thing. The other thing I really enjoyed doing was reading. I always loved
Okay.
reading from a very, very young age. I suspect that's because of the weird circumstances under which I was born, actually. So, okay, this is like
Okay.
going really far back, but my mom and dad met on a missionary ship
Wow.
called the Doulos. So basically, this ship just sails around the
Okay.
world. It distributes
Yeah.
educational literature and Christian literature, right?
Okay.
So it stopped at Kerala, which is this state in the far south of India. And I think my dad
Yeah.
on and worked there as I think, I'm not sure exactly what he was working as, possibly an engine room engineer or something like that.
Okay.
Uh, and then when it stopped at Singapore, my mum got on. And I think that's how
Okay.
they met.
Okay.
So I think they eventually got married in Singapore. Then after I was born, they took me back on board the ship for I think 1 to 2 years.
Oh.
So for
Okay.
my the youngest years of my life, I was stuck on board a
Yeah.
floating library. It literally was just a floating library,
Yeah.
right?
That's
So
true.
if you look it up, it's actually a very interesting historical ship. It was at the point in time the oldest operating ocean liner in the world.
Wow.
Yeah, it just happened to be owned by a Christian organization. So I
Yeah.
suspect that's where the interest in reading came from.
Yeah.
So those were
That's
my two
pretty
really great
fascinating.
drivers when I was very young.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and then how I got well, the school I went to in primary school, so that's up till the age of 12. The school I went to was like a
Yeah.
very ordinary school. It's what in Singapore you would call a neighborhood school, which is just a
Okay.
polite way of saying not a school exactly distinguished by a track record of academic excellence. It might be distinguished for other
Yeah.
reasons, but not
Yeah.
academic.
Not particularly academic
Yeah,
excellence.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
in Singapore, they stream students from a very young age, very aggressively,
Okay.
and the Ministry of Education just came to do the examination for all the kids in the
Yeah.
school to see which kids in my primary school were gifted, right?
Oh.
Like
Okay.
zero of us passed the test, so none of us were in the gifted stream. It was that kind of a school, yeah. Um, and
Yeah.
then every year there's a big national examination where you leave your primary school, and for
Yeah.
some genuinely freakish reason, I do not know how this happened. No one around me knows how this happened.
Yeah.
Um, I ended up doing extremely well for that. I ended up becoming the top Indian scorer in Singapore. Like,
Wow.
how did it happen? No one knows. It's a total miracle slash mystery. I had never even been close to being the number one in my academic batch in the primary
Yeah.
school. And now I was the
Yeah.
top Indian student in Singapore. Like, what is this nonsense? Like, someone made a mistake somewhere. So that happened, and then I went to all the standard elite educational institutions after that, and things kind of worked
Yeah.
out. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is quite fascinating how many debaters I meet who tend to like reading, but mainly as a function of the debate activity rather than
Mm.
for you probably deeply ingrained in childhood character building. I personally dislike reading. I don't like reading. I can barely sit to read through the introduction of a book, let alone the entire book.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Well,
but
none of my debating knowledge comes from books either. I've never read anything debating related in my life. I absolutely detest reading nonfiction. Who wants a stupid book filled with facts and some half-ass punditry about some incredibly complex issue this person probably doesn't understand? Like, I don't know. I read fiction. Fiction it's great. The problem with non
uh,
I was telling Erasmus, so I'm surrounded by nonfiction all the time. I look out of my window and
yeah,
look at that's nonfiction. I look at the news and just nonfiction just splashes itself across my face. I
Yeah,
need fiction to
yeah.
keep me alive.
But did you have any debate characteristics that were deeply rooted in maybe your background, your childhood,
Hmm.
um, that eventually you had to change, or were you able to stick with them and then those influenced your ideas within the debate sports, which still made you a good debater?
Well, I mean, there's probably only one thing, which is that I've always quite enjoyed looking at ideas. I've always found ideas very interesting to play around with.
Yeah.
I got into debate just because one of my teachers said, "You're very noisy in class. You should probably join the debate club." And then I did. And I
Oh,
wasn't any good at it actually until my second year on the national team. So it happened
yeah.
really quite suddenly, actually, in the elimination rounds of the 2011 World Schools Debating Championship. Again,
Yeah.
one of these strange things. I'm not sure why exactly it happened or how. So the one thing which has kind of remained constant is I've always really liked ideas, and I think that's translated into the way I debate. I am much more. I don't really like technical debating.
Okay.
I'm not a huge fan of winning based on the info slide or saying, well, technically the info slide says this and not that. So I'm like, well, that's pointless, right? So I
Yeah.
really like looking at big ideas play out in debates. I think that's always been a constant.
But big ideas tend to lose a lot recently, obviously, because we all have just 14 minutes as a team to prove stuff.
Yeah,
And the requirements of detailed mechanization, analysis, plausibility, all these things tend to sink debaters into, for risk averse purposes, trying to pick the most obvious, simple, low hanging fruits and prove them well, compared to proving very, very big ideas. And I don't know whether that is hurting debate or improving debate, because I think these everyday low hanging fruit ideas are the things any ordinary person could come up with. I
yeah.
don't know what elements debate adds that makes us well informed if we are not allowed within the sport to explore the most grand ideas and then be comfortable arguing them and thinking about them within debates.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting point you make. I mean, certainly, I guess the first thing I should say is that having big ideas does not preclude having detailed mechanization and caveats and all that stuff.
Yeah,
But I think that should not be where you start, right? I always tell the people who I coach or who ask me for advice, when you see emotion, the first thing you should do is stop thinking like a debater and ask yourself, if an ordinary person on the street saw this, what would their obvious big thought be on one side or the other? And 99% of the
yeah,
time, that is the correct big idea. I think that's where you
okay,
have to start. And then the rigor comes on top of that, right? But actually, I find this is something which, well, I think modern debating is not that different from debating uh, when I was doing it competitively. I think
yeah,
one thing that's gotten a bit lost is the idea of narrative. That,
yeah,
sure, mechanisms and arguments are great, but actually, what wins a debate very often is just the underlying narrative of what the debate's about or what's at stake.
yeah,
And that actually is not something you establish by saying, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to give you 4 points of framing and 3 points of context. It comes in like your introduction. It comes
yeah,
in the language you use. It comes with
yeah,
like a really great example you throw into the debate, and then which forces everyone else to talk about that, which then becomes what everyone else talks about, right? I
yeah,
think that has dropped out a tiny bit. It never was that prominent even when I was doing it, but that's dropped out a little bit. But
yeah.
I guess the other point you make is that, well, big idea debating doesn't really work. I think Tedros and I were doing a huge amount of big idea debating, right?
Okay,
So many of our debates we just ran big ideas, and I think it worked quite well.
yeah.
Um, we dropped 2 points across 11 rounds, right? So I think it still works. I think judges still credit it. You just have to do it well, right? So
Someone would say judges credited it because it was Ashish and Tejas,
I mean,
and it wasn't someone else.
no, possibly, possibly. But what
Yeah.
I will say is this. Okay, so in that, the reason why I suspect that's not the case is because I
Yeah.
think that the other teams in the room with us
Okay. Would
also
balance
felt
it
the
out.
same way a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Um, so I mean, to give you examples, right? So I mean, Erasmus was. I'm not sure. Erasmus, were you around for the final, Erasmus?
No, I had to leave before the final.
Yeah, I know
I'm
because you
actually
weren't around.
serious. I'm serious. Yeah. Yes.
So the final you would have really enjoyed, Andrews, because
Yeah.
My speech was 60% quoting from my principal's lecture.
Oh,
Literally.
I need to find that video.
I ran the
Again.
Kant stuff, I ran the anti-utilitarian stuff. It was very,
Oh,
very principled. In fact, definitely in the final, Tejas and I were by far and away the most principles-focused team,
yeah,
right? There were other very good practical arguments which other teams made for sure, but we were by far and away the most principled team. In the
yeah,
roundabout, whether or not we should ban abortion, assuming that fetuses could be transferred like
yeah,
safely and easily to artificial
yeah.
wombs, one of our arguments was that on proposition for banning abortion in that instance is that people have an obligation to have children. Like if you don't have children, that's actually morally wrong, right? We
Oh,
ran that argument.
yeah, yeah,
Consciousness is the
yeah,
only thing with value. Our job is to populate the universe with as much consciousness as we possibly can.
yeah,
In the debate about whether we should have interlanguages instead of colonial languages or post-independent states, we said that the mere decision to choose a colonial language is principally wrong because it's a continuation of colonial oppression, quite regardless of consequence, right? So, I
yeah,
think we can still run many of these arguments. They still work well, and teams engage with it, and we then had to defend those arguments.
yeah,
So, no, I don't think big ideas have gone. I tell you what I think might account
yeah,
for this. I think it's that big ideas require you to commit fully. You can't
yeah,
half
Yeah.
a big idea. You've got to full
yeah,
asset,
yeah,
right? And I think when you're in a very competitive frame of mind, when you're in a very competitive phase of your debating career, you might
yeah,
not want to do that because you might default
yeah,
to something more risk averse.
yeah,
Whereas
Yeah.
because I am certainly not like concerned at this point with like CV building or winning stuff,
yeah,
and I think well Tejas just won it last year, so I think both of us came into this very relaxed, and it was a
yeah,
very relaxing tournament for me. Um, I think when you're in that frame of mind, it's much easier to stand up and be willing to
yeah,
spend one whole minute on an introduction
yeah,
before you actually start your arguments, which I think I was doing fairly often. So maybe that's the difference, actually. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
I wanted to I wanted to chip in here and then ask, because this is a point that a number of people have mentioned. I want to assume that in as much as you look very chilled and relaxed, internally you're still quite competitive, not in the sense that you want to enrich your CV, but in the sense that you don't want to lose the round.
Yeah.
But I've had a lot of people come out most of the time to say that it is when they are at their most chilled self that they are able to win. What do you think contributes to this, and how do you think debaters who still find themselves within their competitive phase can be able to access that and reach their full zen, for want of a better word?
Yeah. No, it's a very, very good question. It's very hard to do. It's very hard to. It requires a kind of weird double think, where on the one hand you really want to win, and on the other hand you try and put the fact of winning out of your mind while you're debating. I'm not sure I managed to do it when I was really competitive. I think maybe the best thing I can say is try in the back of your mind somewhere to remember, like put this activity in perspective, right? In 5 years' time, once you leave, like debating is weird, right? It's a hobby which you can't really pursue seriously once you leave university. It's almost
yeah,
by
Yeah,
definition something you can only do for a short window in time in your life. Um,
yeah,
so have that bit of perspective that in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, certainly, what you'll be taking away from it is almost certainly not your tournament victories. It's going to be the personal connections you made, the friends you met
yeah,
along the way, the whole maybe the real tournament victory was the friends you met along the way. It's totally true. Um, and and the skills you pick up from it, right? And maybe an
yeah,
interest in the world which brings you interesting places in life. I think it's very important to have that always in the back of your mind somewhere.
yeah,
And I guess also don't hang out with people who make you tense and nervous, right? Like find rituals to relax yourself. So
yes,
one thing
Erasmus.
I've always found, both when I was debating and now, is that I don't
Yeah,
really like hanging around. I really enjoy talking to people after the debate. I think that's really fun.
okay,
I don't really enjoy going back into the room after we've all had this nice social gathering and then having to sit back in our separate seats and then be quiet and then the judge is like, well, here are your rankings and here are the reason for the rankings. That I've
yeah,
always found psychologically pleasant. You know, they should find a way to just text us the results with some basic reasons while we're off having fun somewhere, hanging out in a cafe. Can you imagine how nice debating would be if everyone in the debate just like, yeah, let's walk across the street, get a latte, and then we get a text
Yeah.
saying, oh, you won, oh, congrats, right? And we don't need to listen to the judges. I mean, we can hunt them down if we want to, but we don't need to, right? Anyway, so because
Yeah.
I'm not too fond of that particular part of the debate experience, and because the weather in Geneva was so nice, I think from maybe round 4 or 5 onwards, I wasn't
Yeah.
around for a lot of the OAs. I would just go on a walk
Okay.
and take photos, go to the lake, right? And that just was so relaxing. It didn't
Yeah.
matter whether we took a first or a second. I'll be like, oh, okay, great. I look forward to the next debate. So find a way to put these rituals in that. Maybe it means you listen to some music. Maybe
Yeah.
there's a person in the tournament who kind of gets you in the right headspace. Maybe it requires you to just take a bit of quiet time and kind of psych yourself out of being in that very competitive mood.
Yeah.
Because I actually do 100% agree with you, Erasmus, that you debate worse when you're very tense. Yeah.
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 Sometimes,
Yeah.
occasionally, if it's a right kind of tension and the right kind of motion, that can be positive. It can boil over into when you kind of go into like your impassioned rant kind
Yeah.
of speech, which actually can be super effective, right?
Yeah.
I've seen that done before, but it's quite rare that the level of like nervous energy you have like tips over into that because you need a lot for that, a
Yeah.
lot of energy for that. Like maybe in my Euros final, I felt some of that. Right, it was a very ranty speech. But yeah, so there are various things you can do. Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very very brilliant answer. I think if a lot of us discover that debating is going to be far far less stressful, which is obviously better for everyone. There's just another question I also wanted to ask off the back of this stretch. Given you were in the circuits for a very long time, you've left a couple of times and you've come back. Are there any other trends apart from just the narrative building that you think? Is there any magic that we're missing from the past? Something that used to make debating so nice and attractive and a good part of it that you feel the art form has been lost. And I think this is important to sometimes discuss these things in as much as we are self-selecting into the future, bring back some things which are very good for the art and for the sport.
yeah, it's a good question. I can always tell people this. I think debating today and debating in my day are actually really similar. I don't think very much has changed. I think there was a big change going from the kind of Sam Block, Will Jones, Sheng Wu, Steve Hine, Chris Crook era to what I call the modern era, which is just after that. I think there was a change then, but from when I was debating till now, I think it's actually mostly the same. Maybe I'll tell you the one thing I really miss
Yeah.
is the personal speech.
Mm,
There's some speeches I've seen people give where it's really not about the debate anymore, but it's about something they really deeply personally care about.
Yeah.
And you can tell that the speeches are so compelling because they come from a really genuine place. It's almost like they're not making arguments anymore, right? It's gone to a different, much more interesting place. A couple of examples of this, right? So I think a very famous one people recognize is in the finals of, I don't know, that WDC final about abortion, right? Where Will
Yeah.
Jones opens his I think DLO speech by saying, um, I've never been so sure in my entire life that what I'm about to say is correct, right?
Yeah.
Um,
yeah.
and and other speakers had actually
Yeah.
used that line before him, but I think he genuinely believes it in that moment, and you can
Yeah.
feel it, right? Or in the quarterfinal of the World Championship, when Shengwu in that debate about uh, cosmetic surgery to change your racial appearance,
Yeah.
talks about how he felt very trapped in his Chinese identity because people kept making him having to learn Chinese.
Yeah.
Uh, or actually, maybe even just I'm not sure if this is anything personal, but it sounded very personal to me, like Steph Bell's speech in the semifinal. Um, I think it was about whether or not all sexual material should be confined to XXX shops or something like that. I can't quite remember. Or XXX
Mm,
domains, yeah. Um, I kind of miss that. I miss speeches where you kind of lean back and you're just looking at a person. You're not even thinking about, oh, how do I extend on this? How do I rebut this? You're going, I'm genuinely learning a lot about the world and you as a person.
mm,
My
Yeah.
partner in Euros answer did that too, I think, in I think it was a semi-final about whether or not we should treat terrorists as people with legitimate political objectives or something like that. I think I missed that. I've not seen that in
Years.
I've not seen that in almost a decade. Yeah. It's not like I've watched
Yeah,
many of them, so I've not seen that. Oh, maybe one exception. Maybe I think the Bulgarians in the world semi-final about the predominance of left liberal views at universities is bad.
Oh
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
All
yeah,
that
yeah,
as
yeah.
well. Yeah. Right. Um, but I think they did that in a in a slightly ironic way.
yeah,
So I missed that. Maybe that's the one thing we've really lost. Otherwise, I don't think the magic is really gone. Like again, the HWS final was very funny. I was very entertained watching it.
yeah,
Basically, HWS, after I delivered my speeches, I just checked out entirely and just started watching, right? Or texting friends if it was boring or whatever. And then Tejas did all the hard
yeah,
work, POIing and telling me what's going on. In the final, I was just having a great time. I was just leaning back and laughing. It was all very good fun. I will tell you one other thing which annoys me about modern debating. Maybe this is the one thing which has changed for sure, which really actually pisses me off. To the extent
yeah,
I can get pissed off, I'm not really that fast because it is debating after all, right?
yeah,
There's a whole bunch of weird things people do now. You know how everyone's like, oh, debating has become a lot nicer, a lot more inclusive, right? Like, we
yeah,
care about pronoun introductions, we have blah 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 blah, and
Yeah.
that's all great. But people now are doing things which are just, to me at least, really rude and disrespectful. But I don't think they think of these as rude and disrespectful. For example, people sit down when they're giving their speeches. Like, not because of any disability or any accommodation they need, they just sit down. And I'm like, dude, do you think you're so cool compared to everyone in the room that when everyone bothers to stand up and address the audience and the other debaters, you're just like, nah, I'm beyond all this stuff. I'll just sit down here because I can't be bothered to move. Like, what? I don't know, but maybe because I do think about it as a parliamentary debate format, and in parliament you have
yeah,
to stand up to
yeah,
kind of respect to your audience and to the other members, right? I think it's just a
yeah,
small thing. Like, if I was talking to a friend at a restaurant and they were standing up, right, and we're having a conversation, I wouldn't just sit down and talk to them like this. I would stand
yeah,
up. It's just weird, right?
yeah,
It just strikes me as a real dick move not to stand. Or actually, the other one is POIs. People sit down and ask POIs like this. Like, what? Don't do that. You look terrible. I've never seen anyone sit down to give a speech which was rhetorically effective or which had any presence or which had any
okay,
style. How do you look
okay,
stylistic when you're sitting down? How do you look passionate? No, right? When you're excited about what you're saying, when you believe in what you're saying, you stand
yeah,
up. That's just a more
yeah,
natural thing to do.
yeah,
So that's a weird pet peeve. I don't know why people do that. I guess also other weird things are like, speakers just ignoring POIs. Like if someone stands up to ask you a POI, I always thought like it's respectful that you don't just say anything, but at least wave them down. Now people will be like,
Yeah.
no, you don't exist. I don't even see you at all. Uh, or what other strange things do people do? There must be some other things. Oh, when people give personal POI policies before the speech, like I will
yeah,
take POIs in sign language only in these two 30-second windows, and I'm like, why? Why do you want to make yourself look? It just makes you look scared before the debate even
yeah,
speech has begun. You've basically told the whole room, I'm not very good at debating. Okay, people ask me
yeah,
questions, I get really scared. So, but since the rule said you must, please like sign language at me or something. Like, no, just deal with it. And then some people get really annoyed and people don't follow their cute little personal POI policy. Like, I mean,
yeah,
screw you. The rules allow me to interrupt your speech by standing up and yelling information. I'm going to do that. And if it rattles you, that is your fault. Get better at debating. So, in a weird way, people have become a lot nicer, but also a lot
yeah,
ruder in weird ways. I mean, I don't personally care. It doesn't affect me. But I've
yeah,
always
Yeah.
found it weird that, especially people who just sit to do the whole speech. I found that quite disrespectful.
yeah.
Yeah.
I have two for you, um, which I want to ask you about. One is introductions, like the
Yeah.
monologue that for about
Yeah.
a minute you listen to people within your era. They usually have this sort of objective monologue or an assessment of the situation without necessarily even inserting the debate lines or starting to establish their position. And usually that is really enjoyable because you get to see the entire picture just being rolled out for you to appreciate a world view before their debate begins. But the second part is people actually taking POIs and just telling you to discuss it in your speech. So someone would accept a
Oh,
POI, you spend
yeah.
15 seconds asking, and they would be like, "Yeah, I don't know. You tell me during your speech,"
Ah,
which is really,
Talk to
really
me
weird.
directly. Talk to
yeah.
me directly. So he's asking the question because I did that to someone once. The person asked POI, which had nothing to do with the speech I was giving. For example, they could ask, "What do you think happened in World War II?" And I could be giving a
Yeah,
speech about, and I just said, "Why don't you talk about it once you come onto the
Yeah.
stage?"
Yeah.
yeah,
So okay. So my thoughts on both of those. Okay. So my thoughts
yeah,
on monologues is that I think they're perfectly fine, but the timer should start the moment your mouth opens.
yeah,
So if you want to take 90 seconds or 2 minutes out of your speech to thank your coaches in the audience and how what an honor it's been to be invited and how wonderful the food was during lunch, great. Just do that in your speech because those 7 minutes are entirely your playground.
yeah,
Uh, and no, I tell you why I don't like monologues, which are like separate from the speech. They just really
yeah.
sap the energy out of a debate. You know, a debate's going on, someone's
True,
giving a
true,
speech,
true,
right?
true.
You want momentum to build, someone to come and immediately
Yeah,
rebut. And when someone comes on and is like, oh, says all that lovey dovey stuff, firstly, it's not interesting to me. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm just cold hearted, but, you know, if you really love and care for someone and really want to appreciate them, I'm not sure this is the best way to do it. Tell them, go bring them out for a dinner and have a great conversation with them. And that's so much more meaningful than, like, hey, shout out, coach. Woo, you the best. Like, sure, whatever. I don't care. Get on,
yeah,
keep an argument. Also, I think it genuinely affects the fairness of a debate, right? Like, you are genuinely
Yeah,
inserting 10 minutes of stuff. Like, everyone does this. It just
yeah,
drags out the debate. And I'm also not sure there isn't an element of trying to just pander to the audience in that. Like, I'm pretty sure
yeah,
games are being played when people do this. I'm 100% sure. Uh, which I'm totally okay with. You should absolutely play games to win debates. But
yeah,
7 minutes to play those games, so use up those 7 minutes, right? Um,
yeah,
like, can you imagine if Shengwu in his quarterfinal was like, before I start my speech, let me first tell you a story of how I was forced to learn Chinese as a child. I'm like, shut up, just debate, okay? Oh God, yeah. No, I always found it. Maybe it's okay, this might just be
yeah,
it. Like, I can totally see the other side. Oh, it's a very nice, sweet thing. It's
yeah,
generally makes everyone feel good. It saps a bit of the tension and the negative energy which can buzz around the debate. I totally get that. Maybe this at the
yeah.
end of the day is a kind of cultural thing. I lean more on the British, like, please don't show your emotions in a public format. That's very unseemly. Whereas
Yeah,
the Americans are all like heart on sleeve. Oh my God, I love you, you love me. We're a happy family. Maybe that's the root of it. But that's my thought on monologues. Just don't do them. Or if I want to do them, I'm just going to start the timer. Okay.
yeah,
The second one is um, POIs. So I think
yeah,
it is totally okay to respond to a POI which does not seem relevant to debate by saying, "Look, you're a terribly clever person. I'm sure you'll enlighten all of us with your speech, and I look forward to it." I think it's fine, right? I mean, and so Erasmus, I would have probably done what you did. I'm like, you know what? I look forward to your speech, and if that's your extension, all I'm going to say is good luck selling that. But something clearly relevant to the debate.
yeah,
And you do that kind of dismissive response, I think that probably counts against you, right? Because a good speaker will
yeah,
come out later and say, that previous speaker probably thought they were being clever by not committing. No, that's a fatal error. Here's why
yeah,
they didn't actually dare to answer that POI, right? And then they will explain it,
yeah,
and then you look like a bit of a
yeah,
fool, right?
yeah, yeah,
I will say in general, I have noticed people are not quite willing to engage POIs fully. Like if someone asks you a
yeah,
POI, nowadays the default mode seems to be like you treat POIs as an ego contest. Like I will
yeah,
say
yeah,
something kind of cocky and dismissive and then move on, like a
yeah,
one-liner.
yeah,
And I always thought, well, is your ego so small and fragile that you can't take another 30 seconds to engage the actual idea behind that POI or where it was going, right? Um,
yeah.
there's a good faith discussion to be had here. Have that discussion and move on. But everyone
But
like
some people,
Yeah,
Some people just choose one word answers, which is really, really sometimes
yeah,
annoying because you'd ask them, do you think this and that and that? And they would be like, no, moving on.
yeah.
They just end the entire sequence there.
So I don't think that's necessarily a bad response, right? But
Yeah.
honestly, I think there is a way to ask POIs that kind of answer becomes difficult to give. Like if you really
Yeah.
give a POI where a yes no answer is difficult, then they can't give that answer. But secondly,
Yeah.
another kind of good POI is where the answer might be obvious, but it leads to a trap. In which
Yeah.
case, no answer might be all you need. In fact, you might want them to say less, right? Because that no could open up a huge gaping principal concession. You then drive your
Yeah.
entire argument through the next speaker. You might be
Yeah.
more annoyed if the person said, "Well, I guess my answer would be no," with an important caveat that that hypothetical differs from this debate in this way. But my answer would generally be no. That might be a much more annoying answer for your case than
Yeah.
someone who just says no,
No.
right?
Yeah. True.
So it depends. Yeah, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. You put a python around your neck. I saw a picture and I was wondering what,
Oh yeah, yeah,
what,
yeah.
what was
I was
that?
in Bali
Which,
after in 2017 after the World Schools Debating Championship.
yeah.
So I hung out with Kwan Hian and Chin Wei.
Okay.
You might recognize them. I think they did a fair amount of debating and won a bunch of things.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, there was a. We went to one of the temples in Bali, and there was a person there just with a python who was like, would you like to take a picture of a python? And I love snakes. I think snakes are great. They get such a terrible rap just because of Adam and Eve, right? And yeah, I don't know. I've always found them very cute and quite adorable.
Because I'm like, oh wait, I'm scrolling through. I'm like, who does this? Because I'm definitely not going near there. Let alone hang it around my neck long enough
Yeah,
to take a picture.
yeah,
Once it gets around my neck, I'm sure the next thing is to call 911 because
yeah.
the ambulance is definitely on its way. But,
No, but like
yeah,
snakes. Snakes are actually really lazy. They eat maybe once every couple of months, and then they just sit in a corner and digest very slowly. And then
okay,
people say, "Oh, they're slimy and disgusting." No, they've actually got very nice textured, scaly skin. They've got cute little
I've
slit
never.
eyes and a little tongue which wags. I mean, there's nothing not to like. I've always thought.
yeah, Erasmus,
Interesting.
you can pick it up from here.
So, um, thanks so much for sharing. I had one question I wanted to ask. There's a school of thought that believes that as debaters, we are sort of uh, we are cast according to what we want to argue. So we never hold strong beliefs or positions on things.
Yeah,
We are quite fluid in terms of what we believe, we choose to believe, depending on what we want to argue or what we want to advance. Just moving this away from the debate world, is this something you think is better in general for all people to be quite fluid in their thinking, opinions, and beliefs? Or you think there is still a world where people having strong core beliefs, which is fundamental to who they are, is still quite important to how we operate within this world?
yeah,
Yeah, I think it's much more important to have a strong set of core beliefs.
okay,
I think both are important, but maybe the way I want to put it is this: I think it's important that you have a contingent belief in what you believe, right? Like you acknowledge that your views might be wrong, and there are certain things about the world which you should at least acknowledge are capable of showing you that your views are wrong, right? So they're not just
yeah,
unfalsifiable. But even while you're making your beliefs contingent in that sense, the only way you can, I think, be a real human being with any beliefs at all is to act on the beliefs you happen to have, even if you're not
yeah,
100% certain of what they are. Um, I think the great thing about, I mean, it's interesting. I think most debaters actually have a relatively strong core set of beliefs. Um, but I think, in effect, debating pushes people towards the center, which is not a
yeah,
bad thing. Being a centrist does not mean you don't have a strong set of beliefs. Like you can be a really radical, hardcore centrist, right, and have a deep commitment to centrist beliefs. Like centrists are not
Yes.
just people who are like, well, I'm not sure what I believe. Do I believe A or B? No, a centrist would be a person who says, well, I believe in like half of A and half of B, but I'm very sure that this half of A and this half of B is correct, right?
Yeah.
I think that's very,
Yeah.
very good. I think that the fact that debating gives you an appreciation for the other side and lets you see the gaps in your own beliefs is very, very important, because I think the problem in the world today, um, is that people have run off to both extremes. Like, you have some people who are so fanatical in their beliefs that they're essentially
Yeah.
unfalsifiable. There's nothing which could possibly
Yeah.
change their views, right? Like a great
Yeah.
example would be all the Trump voters who bought shares in his pointless, stupid company, Truth Social. And even though it's lost like half of its value, they're still like, no, I will yeet more money into it because Donald Trump knows the way. Um, that's what happens when your conviction
Yeah.
tips over into fanaticism. On the other hand, you have, and I think this is more prevalent among people who are young and on the left, a very
Yeah.
deep-seated cynicism about the whole world. Right? Like, oh, everything is
Yeah.
just power structures and manipulation. There's nothing we can do. No one in politics is good. The whole system is
Yeah.
entirely broken, and that's also
Yeah.
incredibly paralyzing. Because I don't think the system is broken at all. I think the system works okay with some problems. Right? The good thing about debating is that it avoids both of those.
Yeah.
So my views have become a lot more nuanced as a result of debating over time. In fact, I will say I identify as a sort of pragmatic liberal Marxist. I'm
Yeah.
much more left than I am liberal, I would say. But many
Yeah.
of my best friends are right or center right. But when I
Yeah.
talk to them about geopolitical issues, when we discuss issues, we seem to have the same views. It's
Yeah.
really strange. And that gives me a lot of hope, actually, that reasonable people who um, have a genuine interest in the world, who are willing to have their
Yeah.
beliefs challenged and to update them, can actually come to a fairly shared set of beliefs. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's very annoying, I must say, as a debater with a but who identifies as being on the left, that so many of the people who share my beliefs believe in them for stupid reasons. you know, like like, oh God, why must I associate with all of these morons on the left? Because they are just some of these people are wild and genuinely just bad, bad people. Um, but I guess I'm on the same part of the political spectrum as them. In fairness, I think the right has this problem probably to a greater extent, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think that's where having a core set of beliefs becomes important. I know some debaters, very few, whose beliefs are not actually a result of what they care about, their deep moral convictions, but just a result of who they're most annoyed at in this particular phase of their
Yeah.
lives. Like, if you
True.
really hate left liberals, you end up
Yeah.
becoming like some weird alt-right pro-Putin shill, right?
Yeah.
Who
Yeah.
buys into all of that Biden stuff. That's just because you dislike Democrats, but not because you actually
Yeah.
believe in any of that stuff. And I think that's
Yeah.
unfortunate, right? You should avoid that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those are my thoughts. Not entirely coherent in response to Erasmus's question.
No, because I have a follow up. I think it's a brilliant response, especially in showing that you can still have moderate beliefs, but then be super convicted about them. So my follow up question to this is: have you had any core beliefs or any core principles which you've seen change over time? And this can be influenced by anything. It could be influenced by what you're learning about the world, or even age, your experience, right? It's probably something I would also ask as a follow-up. But has any of these things fundamentally changed? And how would you say the experience was? Were you conscious of it when it was changing, or you woke up
Yeah,
one day and said, oh, I think I disagree with this thing?
yeah, it's a very good question. I need to think about this for a bit. Well, maybe I start more talking about what has remained constant, and then kind of segue into where the changes have appeared.
Yeah.
So one thing which has remained constant in that I've always been deep down a utilitarian, right? I think,
Okay.
and because I think every single human experience has equal value, and the only thing which can be valuable in the human life is having its preferences fulfilled, or happiness. You can
Yeah.
call it whatever you want. Um, and I've always thought that the notion that you're allowed to prioritize your interests over any other person's interest is just obviously wrong, right? Like,
Yeah.
anywhere there is suffering, it's equally bad. Um, and I suppose it comes from a place where I think utilitarianism is the only genuinely compassionate moral system. It's the only moral system which says that other people's lives and experiences really matter just as much as your own. And it gives no room for compromise. There's no, oh, because they're my family member, I love them more, so I get to care about them more. Utilitarianism, I think, is great because it says, no, that's bullshit, right?
Yeah.
And I like utilitarianism that it actually dares to go there because I think that's where taking compassion seriously has to lead. Um, Now, where my beliefs have changed is probably I have become less convinced of the value of government intervention in people's personal lives over time. So I'm always very left wing. I've always
Okay.
believed that basically it is very weird that the rich are allowed to have as much money as they do, and that the poor are deprived of as much as they are.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
seems to me like obviously there is no deep moral sense in which the rich deserve anything. There is no deep moral sense in which any human being deserves anything apart from to be happy and fulfilled.
Yeah.
Equal measure. So I've always thought we should just take a lot of stuff from the rich and just give it to the poor. That's remained constant. But I think in other areas, I am less. Um, I have less faith in governments. So
Yeah.
I'm much more aware now as an adult of the way in which government welfare programs, but also just stuff like how governments engage in infrastructure spending, how governments
Yeah.
interfere in personal private decisions in people's lives, how a lot of this can be very corrupt, can be very inefficient, can be very wasteful, can be very uninformed.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think in that particular aspect, I have become quite liberal in that I have become quite, in the classical
Okay.
liberal sense, skeptical of government power and quite
Yeah.
wary of government overreach.
Yeah.
So I, for instance, am much more pro free speech now than I was in the past.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
I still do have, and I suppose I believe personally in a right to suicide. I think everyone has a right to kill themselves, and I think, for instance, if someone wakes up one day and decides their life is not worth living anymore, I don't think there's any conceivable way a government could tell them they're wrong
That's
because they're
interesting.
the ones actually living that life. How can you decide for them otherwise? Now, of course, you can say, oh, statistics show that people who survive suicide attempts come to appreciate the life, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. But I don't think that gets around the fundamental objection that, you can't read minds. So people's personal choices should be very powerfully protected. So maybe that's
Yeah.
the one thing which has changed. Um, I think a good example of this would be like the pandemic, right? Where governments were
Yeah.
issuing all of these contradictory issues of what you should be doing and having to update in real time. Now, of course, a lot of that was done in good faith because the medical profession was itself trying to figure out, do you put on a mask? Do you not put on a mask? Must you disinfect all the
Yeah.
surfaces? Must you social distance 6 feet from everyone? All of that stuff, which we eventually gave up on. But it shows how actually a lot of government decision making is quite random. It's just people taking a
Yeah.
guess, right? It's unavoidable,
Yeah.
and I think working in
Yeah.
government has convinced me of this as well. So that's probably
Yeah.
the biggest thing which has changed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Uh,
I like that
Erasmus, go
response.
ahead.
Yeah, really like that response. I think it's something that myself I'm beginning to experience over time. That when you see things happen within society, it can have a direct influence on where you stand on your beliefs. But what my experience has been is it's not always clear to you that your stance has changed.
Mm.
You sometimes just wake up and you find your response to certain things which are happening within your life and within society a bit different, and you can find it quite surprising that, oh, I don't think I was always this way. So yeah, thank you very much for your response. And Andy, you can take it away.
Yeah, I had one question for you. In the African context, or prior to us getting really integrated into world debate through online, which made it a lot more accessible, knifing was a legitimate debate strategy. There was no way in which opening says something and closing is bound by the framing or the premise of anything to be consistent with anyone. Someone could literally step up, and that was actually defining the fun moments within debate, could literally step up, totally undermine their opening, in fact,
Hmm.
go a step further and rebut them and
Yeah.
go ahead to establish their case.
Yeah.
These days in world debates, as we've come to know it, knifing is literally a doom. You do it and you're fourth, or you do it and you're losing
Oh,
because
okay.
it's really within the rules that you should not be fundamentally inconsistent with your opening,
Yeah.
which makes it a bit weird because then I'm asking, debate is supposed to allow us to express the freedom of thought.
Mm-hmm.
And here I am in the activity, and I'm being tied to, as a closing team, the thought framework of an opening team that never consulted me in
Yeah,
constructing that framework, that I
yeah,
do not know from anywhere, and cannot tell me whether or not I like and I agree with them. I don't know whether that is undermining the freedom of thought that debate ought to hold, and whether or not it's time to just do away with this whole frown on knifing and people just being
yeah.
free and not being consistent.
So I actually like the anti-knifing rules, but I don't think they should result in an auto fourth. So I take a position somewhere in between what you've said, which is that you should not be allowed to openly contradict your opening, and certainly not to rebut them.
Yeah,
But it shouldn't be the case that if you disagree with the premise, you
yeah,
automatically get a fourth. Here is why I think that the anti-knifing rule is actually very fun and very useful. Firstly, I just think in a pure does it make the game more interesting sense, I think it makes the game a lot more interesting
yeah,
because it forces you to do a weird, sneaky thing where you disagree, but you can't be seen to disagree. And I think there's an
yeah,
art to that. There is a way to do that. There's a very specific skill set you can use to do that. To
yeah,
say, look, you can say something like, "Well, Judge, I entirely agree with the opening. That obviously is the major context. I'll just say that even outside of these contexts, have very large interests at play. Here are what some of these interests are and why I should care about those as well." If you say something like
yeah,
that, you're actually just knifing, but in a nice way, which judges will appreciate. And I think judges are
yeah,
nice people too. If your opening has run a crap case, they will obviously give you more space to do that stuff, right? Because you are rescuing
yeah,
the debate for everyone, right?
yeah,
The other thing, the second thing I would say, why I do think the anti-knifing rule is good, is that in real life, this is way more important than rebutting someone. Knowing
yeah,
how to undermine someone while still nominally agreeing with them is far more
yeah,
important than being able to directly tell someone why they are wrong
yeah,
in the
yeah,
workplace, in a boardroom
yeah.
meeting,
That's really
in
true.
diplomacy,
Really,
right?
really, really
The
true.
number of
Yeah,
times I've been able to say to someone, "Oh, well, no, no, I agree with you. You're entirely correct. All I want to add is that we need to take this very important thing into consideration because without this thing, your plan wouldn't quite work. Don't you agree?" And they'll go, "Oh, yes, 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 yes."
yeah,
Right? That's a very
yeah,
important skill. And I think that is one of the unusual beauties, I think, of the British parliamentary format.
yeah,
How to undermine without contradiction. And that's
yeah,
when, as I mentioned earlier, the narrative becomes important. Can without needing to rebut my opening, I can just paint a narrative which is entirely outside what they've talked about,
yeah,
right? And I can do it without knifing. Or you can do the standard stuff like even if, right? Like if it's obvious that the
yeah,
opening is done a dumb context, you just say, look, they claim that this happens in a vast majority of these circumstances. You know, I can't speak to that, but I'm just going to say,
yeah,
Judge, if you don't believe what they're saying, right? Maybe because of what the opening opposition has said, I'm going to give you an argument which works in every single context, no matter what.
yeah,
I think just you're clearly undermining your opening, but you're not knifing them. So
yeah.
I don't know. I like the sneakiness of it. I've
Yeah, I
always
think
liked that, and
I
I think
agree with what
that's
you're saying.
respecting your freedom to run what you want. And a number of times,
Yeah,
look, 90% of the extensions I do, well, no, 70 to 80% of the extensions I do
yeah,
are just me running what I thought was the correct case, which should have come out in opening, or running the same
okay,
thing, but with like some key links filled in, right?
yeah,
Um, so I get very annoyed when my opening runs a total wrong case. I really, really feel it because I'm like, oh my god, you're fucking this up for me, man. Why are you doing this? Like,
yeah,
why do you have to define it that way? I'm now committed to
yeah,
your dumbass policy. Oh god. But then once you get over the hump of the initial despair, you get into
yeah,
fine. I've got to deal with this. So let me now think of a way to defend this utterly stupid policy. And that's like a fun intellectual exercise. I mean, at work, you'll be told by a boss,
yeah,
write a press release for this incredibly bad project, or do a presentation
yeah,
on this thing which you totally disagree with. It's the same
yeah,
thing. It's a very useful
yeah,
skill. So, while I think it limits your freedom, it limits your freedom in a very useful way. And I think, in any case, I think debates don't give you that much intellectual freedom, to be honest. Like, you're given the topic and a side, right? Like, it's a kind
yeah,
of weird thought policing going on anyway.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I think it's how you psychologically prime yourself. Like if you tell yourself just deal with it and go with the flow, it's usually okay. And again, if your
yeah,
opening has done a terrible job, like genuinely run something just wildly indefensible, judges will be nice to you. You don't need to be able to like judge. Here are four reasons why my opening ran an indefensible policy, right?
I think it's usually the tone of how we introduce these disagreements in closing. Because
Yes.
I remember one round where I totally went ballistic and said the manual said I shouldn't knife, but they also didn't say I should defend lazy openings.
Mhm.
Therefore, you can penalize me if you want, but I'm still going to knife them.
Yeah. Yeah. See, so I think that's probably like okay, to be honest. To say your opening was a bit
Yeah,
lazy, right? Like it's a matter of taste. I would have said something like, Chair, I want to give full credit to my opening. I think they got the argument correct. I will
yeah,
note there were some critical links which needed explaining, and I think which this
yeah.
opening opposition has asked legitimate questions about. I'm going to fill those gaps in so that the framework this opening government has set up actually works, right?
Okay.
I think any
Yeah,
reasonable judge would be like, oh yeah, that's fair, right? The argument didn't quite work, and now it worked. So, you know,
yeah, yeah.
it's a matter of taste, I think. Yeah.
Do you think debaters would make good world leaders? Because sometimes I don't
Yeah.
have faith in some of the debaters I listen to.
Yeah.
I think, especially with the freedom debate, it's weird that I'm going from lack of freedom to freedom, but the
Mm,
freedom, the creative freedom that debating gives us, we
mm,
can run. Debaters tend to think the world would be perfect after they run a 7 minute speech, literally promising all these beautiful, big world changes. And you question if we actually handed the keys of the world to them, would they be able to do something about the state of the
mhm.
world and actually transition it into all the beautiful things they describe to us within those 7 minutes? I don't know if you also think about some of these things and consider whether or not debaters could ever be good world leaders.
Yeah. See, I think in a weird way, it all kind of cancels out. So that the average debater is probably no better or worse an average world leader than like a person on the street. Because I think debating
Yeah,
gives you stuff on both sides, right? So the good thing about debaters for sure is that they at least can appreciate there's another side, right?
yeah,
Whereas, if someone rises to a place of prominence in a left wing party, but their entire life they've only been in the labor movement,
yeah,
right? They might never actually have seriously engaged with the ideas of the other side. It's quite possible for that to have happened. So debaters get the other side. On the other hand, are debaters mendacious, distortionary, cherry picking morons a lot of the time? Oh, absolutely, because the format of the game demands that, right? And
yeah,
also, debaters are very good at justifying backwards, right? So the flip
yeah,
side of learning how to appreciate the other side is that you become good at justifying anything. You pick your beliefs
yeah,
first,
yeah,
and then the justifications later, and that's
yeah,
very dangerous. On the other hand, and I'm on the third hand now, but who cares? But I think you say that all debaters give a speech and they expect the problems in the world will be solved.
yeah,
But actually, I think good debating discourages that. I think good debating encourages people to say, look, we're not solving all the problems, but this makes a marginal positive difference for some really vulnerable group,
yeah,
and we acknowledge. And actually, I've seen at HWS many times speakers come out and say, look, it's clear that neither side fully solves this problem. Or even in a
yeah,
more extreme case, I think Erasmus in our debate, right? I think Tedras said something like genocide will happen on both sides anyway, right? Or something like that. But here is why it's a slightly less bad version on our side than on yours. Uh, so it's
yeah,
true that I think debating when you first enter it creates a very blasé attitude. I know all the problems in the world. But once you start hitting good debaters who point out all the issues and you start thinking about them, maybe even reading a bit more about them, you come to appreciate the complexity. Um,
yeah,
so and I find also that many debaters in their professional lives can actually put aside the debating personality. And I
yeah,
don't behave like
true.
a debater in my workplace, or at least I think I don't, because if I did behave like a debater, I'm pretty sure people wouldn't like me, and I seem to get along fine. So,
Yeah,
so yeah, would I trust debaters as world leaders? Um, no, but that's because I don't trust anyone as a world leader, not because they're a debater. I'm just skeptical of people. I'm just skeptical of power wherever it's concentrated, right? It's my
okay,
general political beliefs.
okay.
I'm skeptical of the free market, and I'm skeptical of governments. That's where I am.
Basically, we are skeptical of the entire world.
Yeah,
So,
but it's not in a despairing way, right? I'm not skeptical because I think these things are all screwed up. am
Yeah,
skeptical because I think that is the appropriate attitude for me as a citizen to take towards institutions in society, right? I should not let
yeah,
them get away with stuff. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Just one more, then maybe Erasmus can follow up with a few. We've, I don't know, different people have come to interact with different stereotypes along the way. You talk about Shenguli sort of ranting basically about how he felt trapped in his Chinese identity, and people expecting a certain set of language, behavior, interactions from him by mere way of how he looks. And I think stereotypes have become a thing where almost everyone has their unique set of stereotypes that people interact with them. And I basically view stereotypes as preset expectations that people, without accessing who you truly are by mere version of how you look, or maybe assertions or interpretations about who you should be, create this set of expectations for you and expect you to totally fit in. Have you come across any stereotypes growing up in your professional space where it relates to how people see you and you've had to work through breaking those stereotypes? And how have you gone about them? Because I think it's a daily experience for lots of people, and sometimes breaking free of those stereotypes become a really, really difficult thing.